So once again, welcome to everyone joining us this morning. This is the first in a series of COVID-19 Center Talks hosted by the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. I ask everyone participating to just mute their microphones and their video. We will ask you, as the presenters present their contributions, that you pose questions in the chat box. So please write up your questions. We'll pose those to the presenters once they are done. After that, we will also allow an opportunity for contributions from the floor, from wherever you are, but we would like the questions initially to come through the chat box. So to introduce the topic today, I think we're all aware of the regulations in the context of COVID-19, curfews combined with the restrictions to freedom of movement and assembly. These measures require enforcement, and in most countries, it is the police, often also the military, that have been tasked to ensure that these restrictions are being adhered to. Predictably, perhaps, the restriction enforcement have come also with violations of human rights, with allegations of police brutality, and implications certainly for human rights more broadly. We have 4 presenters today from the Center for Human Rights who will focus on aspects of police brutality and police conduct in the context of the enforcement of these state of emergency or disaster directives. These people are all based at the center and work on particular aspects of vulnerability or human rights, and their presentations will link back to the issues that they usually focus on. So the first of our presenters this morning will be Marystella Simiyu. She is with our unit on expression, information, and digital rights, and she will speak for around 10 minutes on the issues pertaining to this thematic, but also specifically looking at Kenya as an example of how these tensions have risen. So over to you, Marystella.
Thank you very much, Prof. As he said, my name is Marystella Simiu. I'm with the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit of the Center for Human Rights. And as the name suggests, we deal with issues of freedom of expression, access to information and digital rights, particularly in Africa. We also, to some extent, support the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. And given the realities of what is happening right now, we thought it's essential to have a discussion around how police are enforcing state directives in Africa and what are these implications when it comes to human rights. So I'm going to speak specifically to the situation in Kenya. So on 25th March, the President of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, issued a curfew order, and this commenced on 27th March 2020. After that, there have been several amendments to the curfew order. And I remember after his presentation, there was some discussion online about what are the requirements of the citizens in this regard. And I came about a post that was striking to me. The post mentioned that do not be concerned with what you have understood from the presidential address. What you should care about is how the police interpreted that post. So I thought this post was very striking because it's very indicative about the relationship between the police and the public in Kenya. And true to that, the Human Rights Watch released a report around the end of April, around April 22nd. And in the report, they stated that at least 6 people had died because of excessive police force in the first 10 days of the curfew. And this was more than the deaths that had emerged from COVID-19. And one particular situation that struck me was one death of a 13-year-old boy who lives in an informal settlement in Nairobi called Mungwari. He was just on the balcony with his siblings and he succumbed to a stray bullet. And other than deaths, we have seen reports of police looting, police assaulting public members, the use of crowd management tactics such as the deployment of tear gas without any perceptible threat, as well as the destruction of property. And we have also had and seen reports of police asking for bribes, and if not, people are being taken into forceful quarantine, or there's a threat of forceful quarantine, which goes against actually what we're trying to contain this COVID-19 using social distancing measures. But some issues of concern that emerge from the conduct of the police in Kenya show a certain pattern. One is class divide. The people targeted by the police are often people who are in the lower income brackets, people who are living in informal settlements, as well as the youth. Now, Kenya has a large population of the youth, and they average about 28 years. And on top of this, we have a very high rate of unemployment in Kenya among the youth. So these are people, a demographic that is more likely to depend on daily wages for their income and sustenance. And because of this, you'll find a lot of youth having to be outside and can't have the privilege of working from home. And more likely or not, they'll end up encountering police in their work. Another group that is of concern right now is journalists, who in many jurisdictions are essential workers. In Kenya, there was a video that was released online of a journalist who was assaulted by a police during public confrontations with the police and the public. This was in Mombasa. And while he was recording, he kept telling the police the curfew time has not even started, so why is this happening? And outside Nairobi and Kenya, we see other incidences of restriction of press freedom in Zimbabwe, where at least 5 journalists have been arrested during this COVID-19 period. In Zambia, a private media called Prime TV has been cancelled. Its broadcasting license was cancelled. And while the government said it was in the interest of public safety, security, peace, welfare, and good order, that particular television station had been critical of how the government was handling the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can see journalists have also been targeted in Cameroon and Somaliland, among other countries. And the worry here is that it looks like it's a sinister ploy by authoritarian governments to restrict press freedom during this period. But this is worrying because given the uncertainty that COVID has ravaged upon us, it's very important that we have journalists and bloggers and other citizens churning out credible information to the public so as to be able to counter misinformation and disinformation that is in the online sphere. So it's actually very important to protect journalists in this period. So looking at Kenya, we look at the policy and legal foundations of the powers that have been given to the police. This largely stems from the Public Order Act, but the problem is that the wording of the act is very broad and it gives very wide discretionary powers to the police to determine which encounters are legal and which ones are not. And on top of the Public Order Act, we have guidelines which allow for the proportionate use of force when nonviolent means are inadequate to achieve the objectives of the curfew. So what we notice with this wording is that it's automatic, there's an inference that violence is the go-to as opposed to dialogue. And while in Kenya, the president has apologized for the actions of the police, there has not been any accountability on that aspect. And while the Cabinet Secretary of Health, who we have seen more often when it comes to press statements, was asked about the conduct of the police, in the statement, and I will read it verbatim, he stated, "Once again, I appeal to Kenyans to make it difficult, if not impossible, for the police to come in contact with you by just doing the right thing, stay at home." So from this wording, you can see that the go-to or the perception is that when you encounter the police in Kenya, the likely situation, especially in this scenario, is that it's going to be a violent encounter. And so it brings about questions of the fact that, yes, we have had public order management tactics before, but they have never actually been tested in the context of a public health crisis, which is what we are experiencing at the current moment. And there needs to be a change in how police conduct themselves during this period. And to actually bring about this change, we have to look at the history of Kenya. But sadly, what we see, there's been a culture of unnecessary and excessive use of force when it comes to police handlings. And this was something that was mentioned during the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation process that we had following the post-election violence in 2007. And the recommendations of the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, one of the strong recommendations was that there's need for reforms in state security agencies in Kenya, particularly the police and the military. This is because throughout the history of Kenya, they have been implicated in gross human rights violations ranging from extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances, torture and ill treatment of citizens, as well as sexual violence. And what we see here is that there's been a historical disregard for the rule of law among state security agencies in Kenya and in many countries in Africa. And it has always been justified that it's a tough situation, it's a difficult situation, and that is why force is necessary. And because of this, it has perpetuated a perception that force is the best language to make people understand and to comply with laws and regulations, which is a very false perception and a mentality that goes back to the colonial times and should not be encouraged in this day and age. And it's not like Kenya has not tried to reform the police sector or the military sector. Following the 2010 promulgation of the Constitution, there were measures that were taken in attempt to reform the police sector in Kenya, and one of those was the National Police Service Act, which aimed at transforming the police force from a force into a service. And I can at least categorically say that this has not been achieved. It's still a force as opposed to a service. There was a police vetting process using the National Police Service Commission, but surprisingly, the same officers who had vastly mentioned during the process were reinstated, and some of them even hold positions in the same institutions that are supposed to foster police reform. And yes, there are other mechanisms in place. There's an internal affairs unit, there's an independent policing oversight authority, but all these things have not actually achieved that transformation from a police force into a police service, which is lacking in the security sector in Kenya. And sadly, what we see that instead of a reduction in human rights abuses in Kenya, we have seen an actual increase of these despite all these mechanisms in place. And so it's sad that what is happening right now when it comes to police enforcement of state directives goes to the heart of human rights. It's to the right to life, the right to personal integrity, the right to dignity, the sovereignty of the people, the right to equal and fair treatment for all citizens in a country. And if there's to be any restriction to these rights, it has to meet the three-pronged standard of legality, proportionality, and dealing with a legitimate aim. The aim is there, it's just that it is not proportional in this regard. And as I conclude, I just have to emphasize that given the history and given what is happening right now, the enforcement of public orders in a context that is untested, that is a public health crisis, it's important to emphasize that force is a last resort. What we should and government should be focusing on is emphasizing on consistent communication and ensuring that the public has consistent, credible information being churned out to them. And while a lot of African governments do not have social grants that will, or social assistance programs that will allow people who need to be outside to actually stay at home and actually achieve the objectives of social distancing, we just have to find a way where the police are serving the people as opposed to be the actors and the perpetrators of human rights violations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Marystella. For those of you who just tuned in, welcome. You are with us at the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria, on our webinar, COVID-19 Center Talks. And as you know, we are focusing on police enforcement of states of emergency regulations and also the concomitant misuse and excessive force that we've seen transpiring. Marystella talked about the journalist and focused on Kenya. And next up is Michael Nyarko. Michael is heading our litigation and implementation unit at the center. And he will speak a bit about the legal framework within which these regulations are justified, and also look at cases that have been litigated so far in Africa. Michael.
Thank you, Prof. I hope I can be heard. So Marystella has provided a good context within which to discuss the specific regulations that international human rights law provide for emergency situations such as this one. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has actually issued a guidance note on the kind of emergency measures that states can take in compliance with international human rights, and especially the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to ensure that lockdowns, curfews, and other limitations on rights do not unnecessarily infringe or curtail human rights. So in terms of international human rights law generally, states have two options on how to deal with emergency situations. There is the general option of the limitations of rights, which can be applied both in terms of normal times where there's no emergency, states are allowed to limit rights, except for the few rights such as the freedom from torture and slavery and such limited rights that are not subject to limitation per se, so that states can limit the freedom of movement, freedom of expression, and the freedom of peaceful assembly, especially in the context of a pandemic that is seen to be spread through contact, and whether it's from human to human or through surfaces that has been touched by infected persons. But even where states seek to use restrictions on human rights, the limitations in such emergencies because of this public health concern, restrictions must still conform to certain standards, and the usual standards of legality, that the particular restriction must be based on law, and that the law itself must be a legislation that is clear and easily understandable to the general public, and that is accessible to the public, because people must know what the law says so that they are able to order their conduct in a way that they don't fall foul of the law. But the law must also be necessary. So it's not that states can adopt any law at all that they think is something they can use to control masses. It must be a law that is necessary in a way that there is some sort of a correlation between the kind of measures that are adopted and the aims that is sought to be achieved. So one could say that reasonably, if the government said you cannot congregate in large numbers because of COVID-19, it could be reasonable if done in the proper way, but there must be proportionality as well. That you must use measures that are not too intrusive. So the governments must find ways of ensuring that they use the least restrictive measures in limiting these kinds of rights. But perhaps also that you cannot discriminate arbitrarily in the application of these particular restrictions. So the government cannot, for instance, say a different set of rules apply to people based on their gender or sex, the usual non-discrimination categories. But of course, you can make reasonable, if you like, distinctions on who is an essential service worker, who can be allowed access to certain facilities at any time of the day because they perform certain functions that are deemed to be essential service. So non-discrimination is not to be confused with providing distinction and categories on people can have access to certain services or be able to move about freely without limitation, but that you cannot provide different rules for different categories of people based on the usual characteristics of gender, sex, color, race, and such other categories. But also that these limitations must, as much as possible, be interpreted in favor of human rights. So we must, as much as possible, try to preserve the rights of the individuals and communities that are affected by lockdown or curfews in a way that we don't at all times try to justify infringements, but that we try to preserve the rights as much as we can. But beyond the limitation of rights, which is something that states have the office, also may, in extreme circumstances, derogate from their rights. And the derogation is in a sense that the rights themselves are suspended for a particular period of time. So it cannot be an indefinite suspension of the rights. Whilst limitations can be indefinite, that your rights can be indefinitely limited, when it comes to the complete suspension of the rights, it must be within a specific scope. It must be temporary in a way that does not render the right itself illusory. And of course, it must also achieve the necessity and proportionality. And even though states are generally allowed to derogate from certain rights under the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there are certain rights that states cannot derogate from. So irrespective of whether there are curfews or lockdowns or whatever other measures the states your state think is the most reasonable way to counter the spread of COVID-19. Your right to life, prohibition from torture, cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment, and the principle of legality in criminal law, that you cannot be charged for a crime that did not exist at the time that the offense was committed, are rights that are not derogable. So under no circumstance can your right to life be taken merely because there is a curfew or a lockdown or some other restrictions, except where there is a probable justifiable cause, such as the self-defense, or if it's on the orders of a court, or if it's reasonably deemed by security officers to defend the life of another person. But in all these situations, especially when it comes to derogation of rights, states are required under the ICCPR to notify the UN Secretary General, who then must inform other states that this particular state is derogating from this particular set of rights, and providing justification why such derogations are necessary. As far as I have researched, I have not found any African state that has actually notified the UN Secretary General of any specific derogations. So I will assume that most states are using limitation of rights as their preferred mode of countering this pandemic. But whilst states are allowed to reasonably curtail rights in a way that still preserve some form of the right, even in extent of derogation, police officers or other law enforcement who are allowed to patrol streets with the purpose of enforcing law and order, ensuring that there's security for everyone, and ensuring that offenders are arrested, have a leeway to use force. But this force must be a force that is reasonable and proportionate to the kind of opposition that they face, so that the kind of unnecessary behavior that sometimes we see on TV of security officials telling people to do push-ups or squat and jump, or using force, physically abusing people, hitting people, even when they are not resisting or posing any particular threat to them, one can reasonably say these are perhaps disproportionate and force that one could potentially litigate during this period or after this particular lockdown or curfew provisions have been lifted. Perhaps what is curious in international human rights law is that to have your case heard is actually not part of the non-derogable rights, so that states could actually decide that even if you have a genuine complaint, a time to raise a complaint, and that you can only bring a complaint after these periods are over, but there is still the opportunity for people to be able to raise complaints against such kinds of abuses. But the state itself has an obligation when it notices that there is a certain trend of law enforcement behavior that goes contrary to the obligation under international law to properly instruct law enforcement on how to conduct themselves in public whilst interacting with but also to investigate such occurrences and to make the appropriate references to independent oversight bodies and ombuds in case of the police and the military or other agencies. But in cases where there are clear criminality, to prosecute the offenders. Of course, beyond criminal prosecution, which is the primary obligation of the state to take these measures, the individuals whose rights have been impacted may also take such other civil remedies that may be available within their jurisdictions. If, for instance, there is a situation where a person is injured because of police brutality, they may sue for hospital charges, for loss of revenue if they are unable to work because of the kind of injuries that they have suffered, or even future hospital expenses if they are supposed to continue certain treatment for a while. But even in case, they can also sue for emotional distress if they are traumatized because of that kind of police or security personnel activity. But they may also, if the individual actually dies, the next of kin or the people who are survived by the deceased may also sue if they were dependent on this particular individual for forms of damages. So this is something that can prove very costly to a state if appropriate measures are not taken to ensure that law enforcement officials are conducting themselves in appropriate manner. In a time when many states are crying about the possible economic downturn that is going to follow this kind of pandemic, I would think that states would be sure that they are doing things in an appropriate way so that they are not also inundated by a barrage of legal suits that potentially could also increase the cost of expenses that they need to bear, because damages can be quite expensive sometimes, especially where there is someone who has a huge number of dependents and who's lost their life. In terms of the number of cases that have actually been litigated in court on police enforcement of lockdown regulations, so far I've actually only come across one case in Kenya. There have been a few attempts in South Africa as well, but there's a case in Kenya. Kenya actually sued the Inspector General of Police in relation to the public order, the state curfew order that was issued in March. The contention was that this order was unconstitutional, illegal, because it was indefinite and did not provide for certain guarantees, and that the police were using unreasonable force in brutalizing citizens, including even essential workers, because the curfew started from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m. and police would essentially brutalize anybody that they found on the street within this particular time. So the law society asking the court to declare that this particular declaration was in violation of basic human rights. And they had a sort of a slim success, that even though the court disagreed with them in some of the claims that they made, because there were a long list of declarations that they sought, the court actually did agree that the curfew cannot be indefinite, and that for as long as that curfew is indefinite, it is illegal. And this is something that needs to be properly addressed. And also that limitations must be reasonable and justified in an open society, so that you cannot have limitations that are unreasonable, are unnecessary. For instance, one of the things that the court commented on was the fact that even though there was opportunity made for police officers to issue permits for people who needed to go out of their homes within the curfew hours, the regulations themselves were not crime prevention regulations. They were regulations made to counter a certain health concern. So it perhaps was unreasonable that only police officers could issue notification to someone or give someone permission to go out of their home to access certain basic services. So the court essentially also said that the use of unreasonable force is illegal, and that the Inspector General of Police needs to properly instruct the officers on how to interact with the citizens, and the kind of force that is allowed during this period. It's not a blanket martial law state within which police officers can become law unto themselves. I think what we need to remind ourselves is that the law enforcement is there to ensure that there is security and that the law is enforced. The police cannot in themselves become the judge, the executioner in this particular case. The police cannot execute punishment on people because they are breaching the law. If someone is breaching the law, the appropriate thing to do is to arrest them, process them before court if possible. But of course, police also have discretion to give people warnings, minor discretions. So I think I will stop there and come back to discussions if there are any issues that comes out of this.
Thank you very much, Michael. Looking at the legal framework and some limited litigation that had taken place. For those of you who joined us, you are with us at the Center for Human Rights COVID-19 talks. We've had 2 presentations. I just remind everyone to please mute your microphone and to stop your video for now. We ask you all also to make some questions, post questions if you have any in the chat box. We will pose those questions to the presenters. And after that, if opportunity allows, we will give some opportunity also for people from the floor to contribute. Our third speaker is Patience Mpani. She is heading our Women's Rights Unit at the Center for Human Rights. And I think all of us have noted the gendered dimension of COVID-19 and the response. And Patience will draw our attention to the extent to which even police enforcement also has become gendered within the response to COVID-19. Over to you, Patience, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. Frans, and thank you very much to everyone who's taken the time to come and join us in this talk this morning. Professor Frans has already touched on the fact that the COVID pandemic itself is gendered. And like many other disasters or emergencies, you find that the impact of COVID is felt the most or the greatest on segments of our population that have already been struggling to have their rights respected. And so when we look at the COVID pandemic, we can see that it really is a gendered pandemic in the sense that women continue to bear the greatest impact of the disease, sadly. So if you just think, for example, about the fact that women, many of the frontline workers working as nurses in hospitals, you already see a particular vulnerability of women. But also when you think about the fact that the burden of care in the homes lies mainly on women. And then you think about a woman like myself, if I have to continue to work from home, do center work from home, but now I have children in the house who I'm expected to homeschool again. And then of course everyone has to eat and you have to keep the house in order. And if there's a sick person in the household, you also have to take care of that. Then you also see that the impact of the epidemic itself is particularly gendered. And then also another example, if you think about the fact that women rely on informal work as a source of income and other vulnerable jobs that they do. So for example, you find that women are cross-border traders. The majority of them are cross-border traders and the borders have been closed. Or if you think about the fact that they work selling wares in informal markets, and these markets in most countries have been closed down. And then you think of jobs such as sex work. For example, you find that most of these jobs have been severely curtailed by the restrictions of movement and social distancing that the COVID pandemic has brought to the fore. So just to give a context of the gendered nature of the pandemic, before I start talking about how this securitized state or this militarized state has impacted on the welfare of women and girls on the African continent. So we have seen as a direct response to some of the regulations that Michael has mentioned around how countries can respond to the COVID pandemic. We've seen the police and the army being called upon to enforce these regulations. But when the police and the army are being called upon to enforce the regulations, the idea is that the police and the army should be protecting the health and welfare of citizens during an emergency state. However, we are seeing or witnessing incidences of police brutality, which are in themselves contradictory to the intention of placing the police on our streets to enforce the lockdown and curfew. We've also seen the disproportionate use of force and abuse of power by the police in almost all the countries that the police and the army have been called upon to enforce law and order in communities. So if you go right now online and you just search police brutality and COVID-19, you will be surprised to see the number of videos and writings on this issue. And you will see that there are reports of extortion, the police extorting money from people who they meet on the streets, robberies, people are losing their valuables to the police and the army. We've also seen videos of beatings, tear gas thrown to people on the streets. And we've also seen many forms of torture and also dehumanizing treatment of unarmed civilians, some of whom and most of whom are actually doing are trying to go about with their lives within the confines of the law as provided in emergency situations. And of course, of great concern is the number of deaths, life-threatening injuries that civilians have suffered at the hands of police. And so when you try to look at these reported incidences from a gender perspective, you see most disturbingly is that number one, most of the data that we have around police brutality of civilians during the COVID-19 pandemic is not aggregated on the basis of gender. So you usually just hear that, 18 people have died in Kenya, 3 people were beaten up in Zimbabwe, but we don't get to have a good sense of the gender disaggregation of that data. However, when you look at specific stories that are reported in the media, you find that there's a lot of stories around violations to women and girls across the African continent. So for example, I was reading yesterday about a lady from Liberia who was trying to go to buy her market wares, and she came across the police. They beat her up, and then they searched her and stole about $450 that she had in her person. She has since opened up a case with the Independent Human Rights Commission of Liberia. But also, we also see stories of women who themselves are not able to open up cases or to report the police. I was also reading recently about 2 women from Kodri Park, I think in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, who had gone to buy bread and meat at the local shops. When they encountered the police then separated them, beat them up, destroyed their property. So cell phones were damaged in the process. And then the police went on to arrest them, and for them to leave the police, they had to pay fines, despite the fact that they had been severely beaten by the police and ridiculed and embarrassed. So we have such cases in South Africa. We have cases where women who are in their yards, when the police come in and they beat them up, actually police coming in and beating up women in their own homes. We also have cases where the police or perpetrators who are suggested to have been dressed up as the police and the army have entered into homes and raped women. And in South Africa, we have a case of a woman in Pietermaritzburg who actually was raped and killed in the process. And so when we start to look at the information qualitatively, we pick up a lot of stories around the violation of women's rights in these militarized or pseudo-police states that we are now living in. And when you think about it, militarization of states is problematic for women and girls because the idea of a police state does not bring into mind the idea of safety for many women. So if you think about women who are coming out of war situations, if you think of women who are living in violent societies such as South Africa, where their relationship with the police has been very fragile, then you will understand that that seeing this optic of seeing the police and the army, heavy presence of the police and the army does not instill confidence in women and girls, but actually it brings fear for their lives. And so when we also hear politicians such as police ministers speaking a language of war, when they talk about, we are at war with the virus, we have to fight, bring all security agents to the fore to fight the virus, it doesn't give you the impression that we are fighting a virus. It actually gives you the idea that, we are a society at war with itself. And so, so the tone and the language that we are hearing from politicians does not give us a sense of, they are here to protect our welfare, but certainly that, if you do something outside of what is expected of you, then you are going to be punished. And, so the language is to intimidate and to make us fearful. But also what also this militarized state does is that it reinforces this idea that it is okay to use force to handle matters as a country or as a people. So this doesn't sit well when you think about countries that are already violent states, such as South Africa. You don't want people to think that peace and order can only be maintained by men and women who are carrying semi-automatic rifles. Of course, this whole parade of guns and heavy policing also makes you wonder whether the police and the army itself are really suited for purpose. If the idea is to make sure that people get into their homes, they social distance, and also they know how the virus is spread and how to protect themselves, then why do we need men and women with, weapons to be doing that for us, is the question that you ask. And you also wonder whether the police and the army have been trained enough to deal with such situations on the ground. So those are some of the things that really come into mind. And then when you think about the fact that for most of these women, they are being brutalized while they are trying to access essential services. So women going to buy food for their children, women who are trying to go to hospitals maybe to give birth, or women who are trying to access other essential services such as ARVs or contraceptives, and then they are denied that movement. And also what makes it worse is that most of the lockdown regulations have been elaborated by ministers who have given us very contradicting information. And so sometimes you think you are acting in the confines of the law, and then you meet a police officer who tells you that actually you can't do this because of ABCD. It then suggests that even the way that the police and the army are handling these matters is very random and very subjective to the police officer that you meet. And of course, this makes women particularly vulnerable. So it is quite problematic. And also when you think about issues of gender-based violence and how women are now stuck in homes where they are living in very close proximity with their perpetrators, and how their access to move around or to move to places of safety is limited by the curfews and also the police themselves who are on the streets, who do not seem to be sensitive enough to allow women to express their agency, to leave violent homes. It also adds to the mix, and it brings to the fore the fact that we need to be thinking about other methods of instilling law and order in our communities that do not bring in the heavy-handed arm of the law. So those are some of the issues that I just want to flesh out, but we can continue the discussion and look at specific issues as we go along.
Thank you very much, Patience, for that perspective, drawing our attention to the gender dimensions of police enforcement. The last of the four presenters is Ayo Sogunro. He is heading our SOGIESC unit at the Center for Human Rights, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Expression, and Sex Characteristics, a mouthful. He will speak about the rights, particularly of LGBTIQ+ communities, but more generally also about vulnerable groups within the context of police enforcement of the restrictions related to COVID-19. Thank you very much. Ayo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It is really astonishing and unbelievable that police brutality is even an issue we have to acknowledge in this period of humanitarian crisis in the global pandemic, but then here we are. So I agree with my colleagues, of course, on the human rights angles that they've all brought forward and they've all brought to light. But I would like to take a critical legal studies approach to this and to look at police brutality and how it affects sexual minorities and other vulnerable groups in Africa as a perpetuation of hegemonic dominance, particularly in the definition of good citizenship in Africa by our ruling elites across board, and particularly the way this definition of good citizenship represses and socially excludes the most vulnerable members of our society. So as such, I want to look at this from three perspectives. First, the issue of continuing colonization and the need to decolonize Africa and governance spaces in Africa. You see, as I think Marystella mentioned earlier, historically in Africa, the use of the police has always been and evolved as a colonial tool to protect colonial interests against the natives. And so the idea of state security has always been prioritized over the idea of human security. And this colonial theme has permeated and continued down even up till our own period. And of course, state security is whatever is considered as protecting the goals of the state, even if it is at the expense of human lives. And so people who are already excluded from state protection, such as LGBTIQ persons, become at an automatic disadvantage in times like this. So if sexual minorities are considered bad citizens, then they are considered fair game as well for police brutality. This is what happened, for example, in Uganda earlier in March, when the police raided a shelter for LGBTIQ persons who are homeless and then arrested them because they wanted to enforce lockdown restrictions. And so we have this colonial mindset of what policing means, where the citizen that does not fit the definition of the state's ideal is considered excluded from state protection, and therefore it is justifiable to deal with them or to treat them in a way that violates their dignity as human persons. And this brings up the second issue, which is the issue of class control and power dynamics. Again, just as previous speakers have noted, the enforcement of these lockdown restrictions is not equal. It is discriminatory, and it affects the poorest people in society. And this is even more true again for people who are already socially excluded. For instance, we have the situation in Africa where our cities are flooded in a sense with LGBTIQ plus youths who have been displaced from their homes because of threats to their lives or safety. In Nigeria, for instance, the major cities have large communities of young gay people who basically survive by living from place to place on the streets or just getting online every day, trying to find somebody that in school they can hook up with for a night because they cannot go back home. Now, what happens in a period like this? Because we have attached criminality to poverty, it means that these same persons who are forced to be on the streets are the ones who are scapegoated and are considered as the cause of social disorder rather than its victims. In fact, in South Africa and even in Uganda, we have situations where people are already blaming the pandemic, indirectly or directly, on sexual minorities. And this issue of power dynamics and the way it affects the poorest members of society is even worsened when you consider the fact that, as I think Michael noted earlier, access to justice is not considered an essential service. We have the situation where corporate businesses are racking up points for essential services right now, but the idea of getting a lawyer to even file an application for bail in court is impossible. So we are doubly punishing people. On one hand, they're excluded from our usual protections and have been remanded because of this. On the other hand, they cannot even access justice systems so that they can plead their own cases. Thirdly, I want to look at this from the issue of the value we attach to humanity and the issue of our own dignity as citizens in our different countries. Police brutality is a continuation of the criminalization philosophy that is inherent in our legal and political systems. The same way our governments want to ban or jail or fine gay people is the same way they want to ban or jail or fine poor people. Those of us who have long advocated against rampant criminalization are witnesses to this philosophy. Our leadership in Africa continues to demonstrate that for them, all social problems have to be resolved through criminalization. It doesn't make sense. What we have ultimately is a continued bestialization of the human being. We want to beat people into staying at home instead of addressing why they are out at all. And this is the danger of continuous and rampant criminalization. We degrade and infantilize our people, and we contribute to the discrimination that Africans face globally. There is no excuse for the kind of public humiliation and summary punishment that we have seen from some African countries in the last few weeks. And so leaders must treat their people with dignity. If you are not going to whip your richest billionaire, you should not be whipping your poorest citizen either. If you are not going to beat up people for being straight, you should not beat up people for being gay. I would also like to address this. I've seen some rationalizations about the fact that these are emergency measures and therefore cannot, in a sense, please everyone. I think this is nonsense. The fact that our governments are pushing these lockdown policies that are not holistic and that are not inclusive of everyone means that while yes, some people will support it, especially those in the middle classes and above, the majority of people are not able to. And so the idea of you cannot please everyone doesn't make sense because you do not have inclusive policies. Governance should mean educating people on what is right for everyone and then doing what is right for everyone. And so we all have to be able to sit and agree and define first what is right for everyone. And everyone is key here. Again, the theme of inclusivity and diversity. And so the bigger part of our problem is this autocratic attitude to governance in Africa. We have a situation where public officials who have already defined and crafted the state in a way that they best believe is protective of state interests and not necessarily human interests, do not believe they owe an explanation to the public for the actions and the policies they take. And then they are surprised and annoyed and upset that society is not cooperating with them. And so they send out the police to enforce this brutality. So we have a situation where our public officials do not care about the well-being of the majority. They care instead more about protecting the luxuries and privileges of the well-being, or rather of their own well-being, and the few who are already having access to state resources and public goods. If they truly cared about the health and welfare of ordinary Africans, as these lockdowns and this use of the police to enforce this lockdown seems to suggest, they will be sending doctors and social service workers, not the military, not the police. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Ayo for those very insightful comments. I remind everyone just to keep your microphones muted. We will now give each of the speakers a short opportunity to answer to some of the questions that had been posed. And thereafter, we will open the floor, hopefully for a short while, for other contributions. So let me just note and thank everyone for their very insightful questions and comments in the chat box. I noted in particular one comment pointing out that this militarized discourse around invaders and enemies have to a great extent been uncritically perpetuated by the media. And that is also an issue of concern that feeds into what we are talking about today. But let me go back to our first speaker, Marystella, and pose to you, Marystella, just two issues. Some of the comments related to the devolution of authority, if you like, within this context, that we see laws that should be dealt with, or issues that should be dealt with in primary legislation, are now often found in delegated regulation, and issues that should be dealt with by law enforcement often now also give authority to non-law enforcement officials or persons. I wondered if you could comment on that. That's the first. And secondly, I think a number of people were also wondering, but what could be useful recommendations? It is accepted that police brutality has shown its face quite pertinently within the context of this pandemic. But do we have suggestions about going forward, what would be the ways of addressing the forms of police brutality that we've seen? Marystella.
Sorry, Prof, I missed your first question. Would you please repeat it?
It was about the delegation of authority from primary legislation to delegated legislation or bylaws, and the authority that should be exclusive to law enforcement that is now also exercised by non-law enforcement persons in terms of responses to the.
I have honestly missed that. For some reason, I've had some internet problem right now. But I think you said something about law enforcement powers. I hope I'm speaking to the right question in that regard. So I know there's a question about the state of emergency powers that have been given right now. And different countries have had different ways of addressing it. They've called it a state of disaster in South Africa, and others a state of emergency, like in Kenya. And these are being exercised, yes, by the police and in some cases the military. And I think somebody even in the chat has mentioned quite rightfully that, for example, in the cases of the army, let's say in South Africa, they have not actually been involved in active security measures. And because of that, they don't have that humane contact. But at the end of the day, the guiding principles of this goes back to a lot of what our presenters have talked about. And in this case, the limitations, because in this case, there's a need to restrict certain rights because of the public health crisis that we are currently facing. So for example, certain rights that are being restricted are freedom of movement, of assembly. And in this case, whatever happens when it comes to restrictions of rights, and as my colleagues have mentioned, we have to go back to the law, international law principles that are accepted by the international body. When it comes to limitations, it has to be legal, so provided by law. 2, it has to be proportionate and has to serve a legitimate aim. In this case, we know the legitimate aim in this case is protecting ourselves from the COVID pandemic. But to ensure that now the 2 restrictions, when it comes to proportionality, whatever measures are put in place, should be proportional to what we are facing right now. And it has to be served by proper legislation. And I think somebody posed a question to me about lawyers as essential workers, and I'm glad Ayo mentioned that, because in truth, in a lot of countries, Kenya included, lawyers were initially not seen as essential workers. And the judiciary had to go in place and provide measures to allow for the continuation of legal services, because seeing all the human rights abuses that are currently happening, when some executive orders have gone rogue, we need the judiciary to be able to, we need judicial review to look into the nitty-gritties of this law to ensure that they are in line with the internationally accepted legal principles. We are in an unprecedented time, but it doesn't mean that our laws have been suspended. Every order that has been given by the executive has to be in line with the law and in line with ensuring that we will protect the health of people. The other rights are not entirely removed from this case. I hope I have answered the question. I know we had an internet problem there for a minute.
No, thank you very much. There are more questions than answers, and we can follow them on the chat box. But let me go to you, Michael. I think one of the issues that had been raised that perhaps you could comment on, Michael, is that the African Commission, because of the absence of a derogation clause from the African Charter, had essentially held that rights cannot be suspended. So the question is, how does one reconcile that with the situation in African states now, where we see that obviously states of emergency or disaster are being declared? I wondered if you could comment on that, Michael.
Thank you very much, Prof. I don't know if I have an outright answer to that particular question, because if you consider that you essentially would have a conflict of norms where you have the same states that are subject to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also being subject to the African Charter, and therefore states have to decide whether or not the obligations under the Civil and Political Rights Covenant would be in violation of the African Charter. And I am not exactly sure whether the mere declaration of a state of emergency in itself amounts to the derogation of rights. I would think that it would depend on the exact mechanisms that are put in place during these declarations of state of emergency, and that we could not outright say that merely because the state has declared emergency that rights have been suspended, even when the details of that particular emergency situation does not warrant the suspension of rights. So I cannot clearly say that I have an answer, but I suppose it's an interesting legal problem where you have norms seemingly conflicting each other, and these are norms that are supervised by different levels of international relations. And I don't think there is any clear form of if you like, hierarchy between the UN system and the African system. So one cannot clearly say, in case of a conflict, which one really becomes the supervening position. But I would think that whether or not the African Charter is being violated would not merely be because the state has declared emergency, but what exactly is the kind of measures that are being imposed because of that declaration of a state of emergency.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I think, we see also statements from the African Commission in which they made it very clear that the response has to be in terms of a social pressing goal, which we have, but still the measures have to be proportionate and as less restrictively as possible. So in my understanding, in a way, the Commission kind of uses its general limitations framework across the board, whether it is called a state of emergency or restrictions that are more regularized. Perhaps that's one way of interpreting it. We are fortunate that we also have Professor Christoph Heinz, a member of the Human Rights Committee, in the audience. And I will perhaps at this point give him a small opportunity to just speak to perhaps that conflict as he sees it. There's also a specific question, Christoph, that asks how one can now look at a country like Ethiopia, where Ethiopia is a state party to the ICCPR. There are non-derogable rights under the ICCPR, such as the right to life, but in the constitution of Ethiopia itself, that right, the right to life, is not made a non-derogable right. So perhaps, Christoph, if you could come in here and give a brief reply to any of these issues.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this opportunity. It's really interesting, and thanks for organizing it. Yes, and just to say, as I've mentioned in the chat room, the Human Rights Committee did issue a statement on derogation. That's further to the General Comment 29, which the committee adopted before, which set out the standards, and I think Michael has really set that out as well. There's also the Committee on Economic, Social, Culture Rights, which issued very shortly after the outbreak of the pandemic, also their own much more comprehensive statement. And I think it's perhaps too important to emphasize that in terms of international law, rights can be limited, normally through restrictions, and the kind of situation we know about, and also the state of disaster. That is not a suspension of rights, it's a restriction on rights. And then in other cases, derogation, and then the state of emergency, where specific rights may be derogated from, but others they're not, as mentioned. And I think just to emphasize in the statement of the Human Rights Committee, we set out the well-known things that have been mentioned, necessity, proportionality, and so forth, but also just to emphasize that if the problem can be addressed through limitations, through ordinary restrictions, then a derogation is not permissible. And then, yes, in terms of the African Charter and the ICCPR, since the African Charter does not provide for derogation, I think the approach is, as Frans says, that ordinary limitations, the regime, Article 27, and then also the clawback clauses, is really used as an overall kind of way of dealing with it. I don't really see that as a conflict between the two systems. And then if a particular constitution does not recognize a particular right as non-derogable, the international law prevails. And I think especially on the right to life, torture, those rights, that's very clear in Article 4, and the state party ratified. That's clear that they'll be bound by the non-derogation, at least in terms of their state responsibility under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And then just in the last place to link up with what patients and others have said about the military approach to the pandemic. And that's certainly something that concerns me a lot as well. When one hears about a war on terror, a war on drugs, a war on COVID, then that's often just an element or excuse for abuse. I'm also worried about the over-medicalization of the problem, as opposed to looking at all the other considerations that have been mentioned. And then the last paragraph of the Human Rights Committee a statement links up with what Ayo and others have also said, that the state's duty to treat people humanely and deal with respect can never be derogated from in any kind of situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Christoph. We are very fortunate to have you here as a member of the Human Rights Committee. Let me go back to Patience then. Patience, I think some of the questions relate to gender-based violence within this context. And the question may be, but how does a woman who gender-based violence during the COVID crisis access the procedures that may be open to her, and how does the police enforcement of these regulations impact on the possible access to measures that can still give protection within this context?
Thank you very much, Frans. I think I've also seen a comment around access to shelters as a particular example. But yes, what we have found is that incidences of gender-based violence have increased as a result of the lockdown. And the usual measures that we take to assist women who are at risk have to change, because now there's a lockdown, and the lockdown doesn't allow women to freely move where there's a possibility of them leaving the home on their own. But also they are not, so what has happened is that even the services such as shelter services that ordinarily take in women have also got to comply with the health regulations around receiving new women at risk and ensuring that they still protect the women that are already in the shelters themselves. So there's a lot that has been going on that has had an impact on whether women are able to access services that they need to protect themselves in situations of gender-based violence. But as a starting point, we have tried to ensure that women who are at risk to gender-based violence have other means of reporting or calling out for help outside the ordinary use of cell phones or telephones where they are living with the perpetrator. So for example, now in South Africa, there's an app that women can access where you, once you are able to tap into the app, you are able to alert the police that you need assistance, or civil society organizations that have been given permits to be able to go into homes and evacuate women who are at risk. Shelters also have had to comply with government regulations around allowing women in, and in some situations we have had shelters running out of bed space, or shelters that are not adequately prepared to take in survivors of gender-based violence, because they are not adequately prepared for these women. And so the police has had to beef up their FCS units to be able to respond urgently to matters of gender-based violence, and also other avenues of sheltering women have had to be looked into to ensure that any woman who needs protection is adequately protected. And also we would also hope that the police, as they are visibly in neighborhoods, that they are also able to assist women as they come across cases of gender-based violence. So I know on the chat there's been a lot of discussion around how we need to educate the police to be able to better handle civilians, and also to better respond to their needs as they come across them. That is also true, but also we need to ensure that services that need to respond to survivors are adequately equipped. So there's an obligation on the state party to ensure that the services are available and that they are able to do that which we want them to do at a given time.
Thank you very much, Patience. And let us lastly go back to Ayo. I'm reminding everyone just to switch off your mics and even to close your video, because I think it can also interfere. Ayo, I think a number of people raised the issue of, not going back to normal. So the saying is one should not have a crisis pass without, deriving the benefits that crisis, as terrible as it may be, that it may present. So in the context of, police enforcement, police brutality that we're talking about, the treatment of vulnerable communities. What is it that you think we should not let pass by? What from the present crisis should we utilize to inform this post-COVID society that we would ideally want to see?
Thank you very much, Prof. I think it's quite frustrating that at a time like this, where people are having the same conversations in Wuhan, in Washington, in Paris, in London, in Abuja, in Pretoria, across the world, we are all having the same conversation. And one would think there is scope, there is a lot of opportunity for genuine reforms across the world. There is so much more that we can learn from all of this. And yet somehow it seems that some of our countries in Africa are merely digging deep into bad behavior. But yes, there are things we can learn from this. I try to look at 3 things: transparency in our government, particularly as we have all seen the way in which the origins of this virus and the attempt to use autocracy to stifle information backfired greatly. Secondly, there is the issue of what I would call accountability, basically, in our government services, in our use of social data, in our distribution of resources, across all systems of government. We have seen again that there has been more or less a correlation in terms of fatalities and control of this virus between countries that have strong accountability systems and countries that do not. And back to the point I made earlier, there is also the lesson about inclusivity and inclusion and diversity, making sure that everyone is carried along, particularly when it comes to the issue of social welfare, particularly when it comes to the issue of socioeconomic rights. For a long time, we have still been playing this game, and which is proving to be a very dangerous game, of individuals aspiring by themselves to whatever they can be in our countries. We have countries where people are individually millionaires, individually billionaires, but collectively, we are all poor. But we need to take public welfare and public good as a serious social investment. The idea that people can be left on the streets, the idea that people can be left homeless, the idea that people who are poor are on their own, all for us and God for us, so these things must stop. Because at the end of the day, we would be in a situation where something that happens to those homeless persons, to those marginalized and vulnerable persons, would eventually grind the machinery of the whole world to a halt. And that is the vital lesson in all of this. Right now, I would expect that institutions of state, that NGOs and civil societies, and that even private individuals are beginning to understand this fact that the most important thing for all of humanity going forward is that we carry everyone along. But sadly, again, it seems you are digging deeper into our bad behavior and into our previous ideas of segregation and discrimination and the marginalization again of those who are the most already vulnerable.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
From this.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers. I think fortunately we have a few minutes. I've asked people to raise their hands to the chat box, or there is, if you go down to presenters, you'll find a place where you can electronically raise your hand. But I also see someone doing that physically. But I have Dr. Lwai Lwa. I please ask that you be very brief so that we can allow a few people. Dr. Lwa, if you unmute and show us also maybe your video and make your short contribution, Dr. Lwa.
My name is Dr. Luando Lwaisha from Zambia. It's not necessarily a question, but just a small contribution, especially on the police brutality and the freedom of expression. Like I was very much interested where you cited the closure of Prime TV in Zambia. And I also wish to make a contribution like the COVID-19 has also brought about police brutality in the name and enforcement of the Public Order Act. Yeah, that is my contribution. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lwa. I see Ashiraf Mugalula. Ashiraf Mugalula, please. Please, Ashiraf, unmute. We don't hear you.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the opportunity.
Ashiraf.
Ashraf, and my yes.
I think
yes,
take
Professor.
off the video, then we will hear you better, please.
It's okay, Professor. What is about the mindset of the police regime? That in order to stop the police brutality, we need to put human dignity at the center of the way human rights retaliate with other covenants that these African states are signed to and ratified and are bound by.
Thank you very much, Ashiraf. I think that unfortunately the link is not very good. Can we try Sharon Ofisi? Sharon Ofisi, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, Sharon. Unfortunately, that's also not very audible. I'm sorry. It is technically difficult. Let me try. Please, everyone, switch off your microphone and close your video. I'm just going to try Atieno Ogola. Atieno Ogola. Ashiraf, please switch off your microphone.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the discussion. It has been very fruitful. I'd just like to encourage all human rights lawyers and defenders in the various countries to try and help the citizens to curb the human rights violations that are occurring in their countries and see how the courts can be able to mitigate such kind of violations. Thank you.
Thank you. That was short and sweet. Let us try again. Tata Sunjo. Tata Sunjo.
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. It's been a wonderful presentation from our panelists. I just have this little contribution. That the increasing rights violations in the wake of enforcing COVID-19 measures is simply a reinforcement of the governance lapses that have been created, and as such, we have a deeply divided society, which the police is exploiting to make gains in whatever way they can, and this is definitely translating into those human rights violations. And so I think it is very important for us to continue to scramble for good governance, because it's only through good governance that most of these rights violations can stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let me try Angela Odo. Angela Odo.
Thank you very much. This is Godwin Odo, actually, but I had technological challenges, so I'm borrowing my wife's tablet. That's why her name is out there. For me, I think there are two critical issues. One is that if we promote rule of law and good governance, irrespective of the situation in the country, then under this kind of state of emergency measures or measures put in place to enforce the COVID-19 regulations, we would have little or no violation because it becomes more or less a way of life, so to say. Secondly, in Nigeria, you had a situation where within the first 2 weeks of lockdown, law enforcement agents had killed 18 persons in the guise of enforcing the lockdown order, when there were still just about 10 deaths from the COVID pandemic. So you see that the law enforcement agents, in the guise of enforcing the measure, had killed more people than even the pandemic itself. One of the challenges we have in providing legal services here is that the regulations made by the president did not include lawyers as one of the groups of people declared to be on essential services. So even when they've established mobile courts to try people on the spot, those people who are tried on the spot are denied their due process rights because they can't even have the access to legal practitioners of their own choice to provide their defense. But we're still working to file 1 or 2 cases in court and to see if we can get the courts to declare that the prompt trials on the spot without giving them the opportunity to get legal practitioners of their choice also amounts to a violation of their due process and fair trial rights under the Constitution. And we hope that will be successful to set a precedent for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Godwin, and nice to see you. So my apologies to anyone else who still has their hand raised. We apologize, but I realize we've scheduled this session for an hour and a half, so I don't want to interfere with everyone's very busy schedules. Let me just, in final roundup, give each of our presenters 1 minute to give 1 or 2 salient points that they take from today's discussion. So again, the same order, Marystella, your 1 minute brief take home. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you for the participants who are here today, but if I could actually yield my time to one participant, because I think the participant raised their hand so often, and I think they're really itching to say something. So can I yield my time to Mpani, but say thank you for all the contributions that have been made today. And we really hope that, I know for me, I think I'm a bit, when it comes to police reform, because I've seen it being, like we've tried it in Kenya, but it has sort of failed. So I'm a bit dissuaded when it comes to what measures we can do in handling this. But as stakeholders, I believe we still have to continue in this conversation. We still have to push to ensure that our police forces are actually there to serve the people. But let me stop so that I can yield my time, just a few minutes, if you would allow, to the participant who was itching to speak. Thank you.
You were raising your hand on the screen. You can come in now. Ntini, who raised your hand on the screen. Marystella gave you her 1 minute. Please, you can come in.
Hello?
Yes, please proceed.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Right. Now, I want to focus on the matter of police brutality under this COVID. These are the consequences of the failure of African governments to teach human rights, providing human rights education to the young citizens and even the adults. Now, it is important that citizens understand and practice their responsibilities correctly, so that when the state says we are involving the police and the army to support our citizens in doing what is right for themselves, there is no clash of interests or forces. I think we must also understand when we record and criticize police brutality and army brutality, that these are the forces who we rely upon in the event of a very severe need, and that human rights should not necessarily weaken the apparatus of the state, but polish it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that contribution. Let me then turn to Michael for his 1 minute final comments.
Thank you, Prof. I think it is safe to say that whether there are limitations or derogations, whether there are states of emergencies or lockdowns, whatever measures states are taking, they need to be reminded that human rights do not necessarily stop before there are emergency situations, and that police officers, and if they are supported by other law enforcement agencies, are only allowed to use reasonable force to defend themselves, and in instances where there is reasonable force to disperse crowds and other such situations. It is not an opportunity to go all out brutalizing people because of a pandemic, and that in the enforcement of these particular lockdowns, our aim must be to protect human lives, to ensure that people's lives are as reasonably protected as possible, and people can continue to live their lives without fear of the same law enforcement that is supposed to protect them now becoming the terrorizing entity that is brutalizing them. But also to finally say that these kind of brutalities can become very costly, because we can foresee that in properly educated citizenry, there will be a barrage of human rights litigation due to this kind of brutalities after these lockdown regulations are lifted. So that states don't want to be saddled with huge compensation and other kind of costs related to litigation arising out of police and other forms of law enforcement action that comes out of these COVID-19 regulations, so that we can use these monies that could have been used to pay off litigation debts to actually do social intervention and provide socioeconomic amenities to the citizens